I don't work nights anymore, but for a long stretch of time, I spent my hours in a place where shadows stretched long and the air always seemed thick with something unseen. I worked the night shift in a residential care facility for the elderly, and on weekends, I was the only one in charge of a lockdown dementia ward. There were 15 residents, all in varying stages of mindlessness, and only me to keep watch over them through the haunted hours of the night. There were nights when the place felt like a tomb, quiet, hollow, with only the echoes of voices long forgotten. Around 3 a.m., after my usual rounds, checking on each resident, making sure they were safe and undisturbed, something happened. The doorbell rang. It wasn't just a ring either. It was insistent, like someone standing just outside, waiting for an answer. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. This was a secure facility, locked tight, and the middle of the night. There was no reason for anyone to be at the door. I shuffled over to the window, pulling the curtains aside. But there was nothing. Nobody standing there. I stood there for a moment, half thinking it was a trick of the mind, fatigue playing its usual tricks on me. Still, something gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I shook it off. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, maybe just too many late nights, too many shifts in the dark. I tried to dismiss it, but then the doorbell rang again. This time, I moved faster, my heart thudding in my chest as I approached the window. I looked out, empty. But across the street there was a car, out of place, parked where no one should have been. It didn't belong. I snapped a photo of the car, just in case, and moved back to my station. I was seated with Mrs. Langford, a sweet old woman whose mind had long since been swallowed by the fog of dementia. She had been playing cards with me, though she often forgot the rules. As I sat down, she stopped, looked at me with those glazed eyes, and said, "What did the gentleman want, dearie?" I felt my blood run cold, but I tried to pass it off. Hallucinations were common with dementia. Mrs. Langford was never good at keeping track of time, let alone people. Still, the hairs on my neck were standing straight. The doorbell rang again, more urgent this time, and my heart began to race. I glanced at the hallway. Another resident, Mr. Sweeney, was awake. He was walking up and down the corridor, mindlessly painting the air with a clean brush as though there was something only he could see. I passed him, and he turned to me, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Don't answer the door alone. He might hurt you," he said, his face eerily calm, before continuing his imaginary work. I froze for a moment. The doorbell rang again, and my fear was no longer a distant thing. It was right there, clawing at me. I hurried to the window once more, and sure enough, that damn car was still there. But this time, as I scanned the yard, something else caught my eye. A shadow moved in front of the door. Someone was standing just out of sight, pacing. Then, with a suddenness that nearly stopped my heart, a face appeared in the window. Eyes locked with mine. It was a direct, gut-wrenching moment of eye contact, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. I screamed, startled, and my pulse hammered in my throat. Mr. Sweeney started to freak out. His brush dropped to the floor with a clatter. The figure outside bolted, disappearing into the night. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and grabbed the phone, dialing the police. It wasn't long before 2 officers arrived, their footsteps heavy in the silence. Chaos erupted in the facility, waking all the residents, sending them into confusion. The officers helped me settle things down, but it took a while. It felt like hours before the place was calm again. And then, just as the adrenaline began to fade, one of the officers filled me in on the night's strange events. Down the road, a woman had been attacked in her bed. Someone had broken into her house, ransacked it, and left her bloodied, looking for something, drugs. It made my stomach churn to think about it. And though I'll never know for sure, I can't shake the feeling that the man at my door wasn't just some random drifter. He'd been looking for something that might have been in the facility that night. Maybe the same thing he was looking for in that poor woman's house. It's a thought that haunts me still. I was grateful for the security at the facility. Really, the place was locked down tighter than a drum, and that was the only reason I could sleep at night. Apparently, the man who tried to get in just took the next best option. What I'll never understand, though, is how two of my residents, people who couldn't remember their own names half the time, knew there was someone outside who wanted to hurt me. They hadn't been near the door. They couldn't have seen him. They were as out of touch with reality as anyone could be. And yet, they both spoke up in unison, warning me. It was like one of those eerie guardian angel moments, or maybe just some cosmic coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than chance had been at play that night. Not long after that, I left the job. They wouldn't hire another person to work the night shift, even though they were understaffed. Something that would have been basic common sense according to the guidelines. I couldn't stick around after that. From there, I moved on to a new gig. A water treatment plant. Graveyard shift. The plant was as isolated as you can get, stuck on the edge of a highway that connected two cities about an hour apart. Nothing between them but empty fields and trees. All of it bathed in a heavy, oppressive quiet that could make anyone's skin crawl. And of course, it was just me there, checking the levels and making sure the equipment didn't explode. Easy, right? Maybe. Maybe not. The facility was surrounded by an 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence. Locked, but the access door was always open, which I never really understood. I spent most nights in the control room, alone, killing time on my Nintendo DS. The only sound the soft click of the buttons and the hum of the machines around me. I was zoning out when the voice came from behind me. It startled me so badly, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Get on the ground," it said, rough, desperate. I spun around, and there he was, a man standing right behind me, holding a gun. He'd climbed over the fence, torn himself up on the barbed wire, and now he was standing there, bleeding in several places. I was frozen for a moment, too stunned to react. He shouted again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees, my heart pounding in my throat. The man kept the gun pointed at me as he stepped closer, his voice shaky with apology. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, "but I have to do this." I wondered if he was hired to kill me. What the hell had I done to deserve this? He demanded my truck keys, my wallet, my phone. I handed them over, hands trembling. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to. Then he tied me up. Duct tape, the kind you'd use to fix a leaking pipe, wrapping it tight around my wrists and ankles. I had no idea what was going to happen next. Was I going to die here tonight, alone in this cold, isolated place? Or was this some kind of kidnapping, and I was going to disappear without a trace? My mind spun, but all I could do was sit there, tied up, as he backed away, mumbling apologies like some kind of broken man. Then I heard the truck start. The engine roared to life, and the tires crunched over the gravel as he sped away. For a long while, I just sat there, unable to move, too shaken to think straight. The duct tape wasn't tight enough to hold me for long. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to free myself. I crawled over to the emergency phone, shaking as I dialed the police. They promised someone would be on the way, and when the officers arrived, they took down everything I could remember. They asked all the right questions, but I could tell they were just as confused as I was. The next day, the truth came out. The man who'd attacked me wasn't just some random criminal. He'd escaped from an inmate transport a few days before. He'd been on the run ever since, desperate, maybe running low on options. The police said he'd probably walked a long way to get to the plant, considering how isolated the place was. I got most of my stuff back, the truck, my phone, my wallet minus the cash, but they found him trying to pawn my stuff in the next town over. He was caught, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random robbery gone wrong. Something about that night, about him, just didn't sit right. I think about that night a lot. In fact, I've had to go to therapy for it just to keep my head straight. The man was obviously desperate, but I think there was more to it than just a simple robbery. Maybe he'd been planning on killing me from the start. If he'd done that, he would have had more time to make his escape. By the time the police were called, he'd be long gone. It makes sense in a twisted way. I've had my share of strange encounters, even in that isolated water treatment plant. But that night was easily the most terrifying thing I ever went through. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just a pawn in something much bigger. I was lucky to get out of there in one piece. But luck only stretches so far before it snaps. A few years before that, I worked another night shift job at a hotel in South Carolina. It wasn't bad during the summer months. Families, vacationers, the occasional drunk tourist stumbling back to their rooms at 3 a.m. But winter was a different story altogether. The cheap weekly rates we offered were designed to lure in snowbirds, retired folks escaping the cold up north. The problem was, not all of them were the quiet, laid-back retirees looking to relax on the beach. Some of them were, well, let's just say they weren't the kind of people you'd want to share a hotel with. Winter brought in a cast of characters that made the summer crowd look like angels. We got more than a few meth heads, runaways, and, God knows, people with intentions that were far from innocent. I'd stumbled into more than my fair share of messes during those graveyard shifts. I'd found hidden meth labs in the back rooms, had to break up more than one physical altercation, and even had to call the cops when one guy threatened to burn the place down. But none of that compared to the night I'll never forget. The night everything went from bad to worst-case scenario. I was working the midnight shift as usual. It wasn't a busy night, just the odd customer checking in or out. I had a friend, Andrew, who worked late-night maintenance at this hotel, and two others our company owned. He'd often stop by after his shift, and we'd grab food, shoot the breeze, and kill time. We just ordered something, and Andrew was getting ready to leave to pick it up when the night took a turn. I was walking into the office to grab some cash for the food when I heard the bell, a customer entering. It was the kind of sound that, at that hour, always felt like it was stretching the silence. I hadn't been expecting anyone. As I was walking back into the lobby, I saw Andrew suddenly collapse in front of me. He went down like a rag doll. It all happened too fast. Before I could even react, a man came around the corner, a short steel pipe in his hand, and swung it at my head. The world went fuzzy for a second. I staggered back, my knees buckling under the blow. I remember the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, the ringing in my ears. And then, in that half-conscious daze, I heard the man's partner yell, "Andrew got away! He found a cop! We gotta go!" Everything happened in a blur after that. I barely made it to my feet, dizzy and disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I scrambled to the back office to call the police, but the phone was malfunctioning, crackling and cutting out like some kind of sick joke. Frustration boiled over, and I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I was scared, really scared. I didn't know where Andrew had gone, and the thought of him being out there, alone, scared the hell out of me. For all I knew, those guys could come back at any moment. They'd already shown they weren't afraid to get violent. I rushed to lock the door, my mind spinning, adrenaline kicking in. I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only just beginning to spiral out of control. I finally got the phone to work, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. I told the operator I'd been attacked, that I needed both an officer and an ambulance. But I didn't unlock the front door until the cops and ambulance finally arrived. By then, the gravity of the situation had settled in, though it still felt unreal. After I found out that Andrew had somehow managed to jump over the desk and escape, I couldn't help but marvel at how he'd done it. He ran out the back door, just as luck would have it, and flagged down a cop driving by. I ended up in the hospital ER, my head stitched up with 10 staples, morphine flowing into my veins to dull the pain. I thought I'd only been hit once, just that single, hard blow, but the truth came later, when the hotel security footage painted a different picture. The man didn't stop at one punch. He hit me 10 times. I had no memory of it, of him repeatedly smashing that pipe against my skull, my hands grabbing for it like a desperate animal. The whole thing felt like a dream, but not the good kind. The moment he heard Andrew had escaped and found a cop, his partner said they had to leave. I don't know why they attacked me. The cops said it was a botched robbery, but there's a darker theory that gnaws at me. What if it was revenge? After all, I'd broken up fights, found meth labs, and made enemies. It's possible one of those people wanted to make me pay for what I'd done. It didn't matter, though. The whole thing left me shaken, a broken version of who I'd been before. I tried to come back to the job after I recovered, but the PTSD was like a shadow hanging over me, always waiting to grab hold again. I couldn't shake the fear, so I left. As far as I know, the men who attacked me were never caught. The night shift had always been a strange beast. I worked in administration at a large manufacturing plant. The night crew was small, just 5 of us in administration alongside 5 security guards, the kind of skeleton crew that made the nights drag. There wasn't much to do but watch the clocks tick, occasionally glancing at the monitors. The silence was oppressive, like it was waiting for something to happen. And then it did. One night near Halloween, a cold chill in the air. I took my lunch break in the parking lot, stepping outside to grab my jacket from my car and light a cigarette. The back door was closest to the fence, a 10-yard stretch of grass and shadows, lit only by a motion-activated light. The light flickered on as I waved my arms to keep it alive, trying to find some warmth from the cigarette and the stale air. But the light died, and everything fell into darkness. I sat there for a few moments, taking a drag and watching the moonlight flicker across the empty grass. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling by the fence. I froze, listening. Could have been an animal, but it wasn't like anything I'd heard before. The wind barely stirred, so this was something else. When I stood up and waved my arms again to trigger the light, I spoke, calling out into the dark. "Hello?" I asked, my voice uncertain. The noise stopped, just for a moment. I waited. My heart thudded in my chest, but I could hear nothing but the crickets. Then, as the light flickered back on, I saw something moving. The fence, it jiggled again, but now I could make out a shape. A person hunched over, fiddling with the links. I thought it might be a kid, maybe trying to sneak around and spook us, though it didn't make sense. This person wasn't a kid. There was no energy in the way they moved. I radioed the security desk. "There's someone by the fence on the north side," I said. "They're messing with it. Can you see it on the cameras?" The response came back fast, but something was off. "No movement at the fence," the guard replied. "You sure?" Before I could answer, the sound of the fence shaking violently cut through the night, like something huge had just slammed against it. The sound of the links rattling was deafening, and before I could even react, I saw it, him, the figure charging toward me. My heart leaped into my throat. I knocked the coffee cup out of my hand as I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. I bolted for the door, slamming into it and locking it behind me, hands shaking, barely getting the deadbolt in place before I heard the footsteps outside, pounding toward me. The knob rattled violently under my grip, each twist sending a shiver down my spine, like something or someone was trying to tear its way in. I could feel it, the pressure on the other side of the door, as though whatever it was had weight, had purpose. The air felt thick with something that didn't belong, like the room had been sucked dry of any warmth. By the time security finally arrived, I had the deadbolt in place, my heart hammering against my chest. The knob had stilled, but it didn't make sense. I had felt the force of something pushing against it, heard the scrabbling. The security workers barely looked at me when I told them what had happened. I watched their eyes slide past me, dismissing the terror in my voice. They were too busy trying to make sense of the security footage, which was a joke. The cameras had caught only me alone standing outside. Empty grass, a silent fence. It felt like a cruel trick, like I'd made it all up. But then, something caught my attention on the second look. The door handle. It was moving. Not from me, not from anything I was doing. There was no wind, no natural cause. It just kept flicking down, jerking hard, like something desperate, something angry. Both the inside and outside cameras showed it. That door handle moved when no one touched it. And just before I ran, before the panic set in, we all saw the slight jolt of the fence, like something had brushed up against it. Something large. But there were no holes, no signs of anyone being there. Nobody wanted to believe it. They had their explanations: moonlight playing tricks, an overactive imagination, too much coffee, too many late shifts. But I couldn't shake it, couldn't let it go. I'd never felt that way before, like my mind was playing tricks on me. No, it was real. That door handle jerking down, the way it pulled away from me when I wasn't touching it, that wasn't my imagination. I knew it in my bones. But what did I have to prove it? Nothing. Just that sick feeling crawling up my spine every time I thought about it. So I worked the rest of my shift, the door locked, no one using the back entrance again that night. Everyone stayed clear, but we didn't talk about it. Not really. The oldest security guard, the one who'd worked there the longest, was finishing his shift with me in the office when, right before he clocked out, he cleared his throat and said, "I never liked that north end. Feels like someone's always watching me." It was the most he'd said to me in years, and it hit me like a hammer. Something about that statement made it feel heavier, more real. He didn't speak much, but I knew he knew too. I stayed for another 7 months after that, but I never went back out that way. I made excuses. I stopped smoking, took my breaks inside, spent hours chatting with coworkers just to avoid the back door. I didn't care what anyone else thought. I wasn't imagining things. Not then, not now. I still remember that door handle jerking down by itself like it had a life of its own. Then there was the subway. The overnight shift at a 24-hour truck stop. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills, and most nights it was quiet. The truckers would stop by, grab a quick bite, and leave, and I'd be left alone behind the counter, cleaning or scrolling through my phone, lost in the quiet hum of the place. But that night, things took a turn. The guy who walked in was off. I didn't notice it right away, just that he was staring at the menu. His eyes glazed, like he couldn't make up his mind. When he asked for a sandwich, I assumed maybe he'd called ahead. But when I asked his name, he stepped forward, and that's when I saw it. Blood. Everywhere. Soaked through his shirt, splattered across his jeans, dripping onto the floor in dark, sticky pools. The light in the store was dim, but when I saw the red, the realization hit me hard. This man wasn't just bloodied, he was covered in it. And not a little. No, this was more than someone's nosebleed. This was something else. I froze, just for a moment, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but inside, I was already panicking. He just waved me off, said I didn't need to know his name, just make him a sandwich. I wanted to call for help, but I didn't want to startle him. I told him I needed to grab some more lettuce, made an excuse to go to the back. When I got there, I signaled my coworker to grab the off-duty state trooper who worked security. A few minutes later, he walked in, and I saw him instantly assess the situation. He wasn't surprised. He moved slow, smooth, like he'd dealt with this before. But then, just as he got close, the guy tensed like a cornered animal. The trooper reached out, grabbed him as the man tried to bolt. He wasn't fast enough. The trooper had him cuffed in seconds. Later, we found out the man had been stabbed. He didn't even realize how bad it was, didn't understand that he was bleeding out. He had murdered someone earlier that night, stabbed them and left them for dead. And now, here he was, asking for a sandwich like it was just another Tuesday, walking into a subway covered in someone else's blood, acting like it was no big deal. The chill that ran through me that night, it didn't leave. It never did.